Hi, it's Allie and welcome back to my channel. So for today's video, I thought I would talk about my favorite books. So I have quite a few books here and these are just my current favorites. So I have a very wide range of taste when it comes to books. So my favorite books are kind of all over the place. These books stuck out so much to me that they made it to my top favorite books. So let's go ahead and get into it. First up, I have The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. And this book is a retelling of the Achilles story. But it's a little different than what we know of Achilles. So we know Achilles during the Trojan War. He's a little bit older then, but this book follows Achilles as he is a boy growing up until he gets to the Trojan War. Now, we are not reading this book through the view of Achilles. We're reading through the view of Patroclus, which is Achilles' longtime childhood friend. Now, Patroclus was originally a prince, but he did something shocking and they exiled him, and he was sent to Achilles' home. There, him and Achilles created a very close bond. So this story is so good. I absolutely love it. It's very heart-wrenching. It's so different than what I had known about Achilles. And Patroclus, I didn't even know much about, so it was interesting to get a little backstory on him as well. So I know a little of Achilles from the Iliad, and also the movie Troy, which I don't think does justice to the story of Achilles. So I think this story is so interesting, and it gives Achilles more of a softer side to him. You get to see why he does the things he does and why he turns out the way that he turns out during the Trojan War. It's definitely a book to pick up. This book brought tears to my eyes several different times. It's just such a good story. Next up, by the same author, we have Cersei. And Cersei is a retelling of the Odyssey of some sort. So Cersei, if you haven't read the Odyssey, is the witch in the Odyssey where she turns men into pigs when they come to her island. Now, Cersei is not only a witch, but she is a goddess. She's a daughter of a god. But Zeus felt threatened for her, so he exiled her to an island. So Cersei does all that she can to protect herself from the other gods, and she ends up having to decide whether or not she wants to be a goddess and part of the gods and belong with them, or if she would rather belong with the humans. Now, in this story, just like in the Odyssey, we meet Odysseus as he comes to her island, and it kind of is a different view of it, because in the Odyssey, we have Odysseus's view, but in this book, we have Cersei's view and what Odysseus came across as to her. Also in this book, we meet the gods Athena, Hermes, Zeus, and many more. So this book is very exciting. It's very political in a way, so if you like this kind of book, this is very good intermixed with the Greek mythology. I think Madeline Miller does a great job of her retellings. I can't wait till she comes out with her next book. My next favorite book is actually a series, and it is the Eleanor of Aquitaine series. The first book is The Summer Queen, the second book's The Winter Crown, and the last book is The Autumn Throne. And these books are by Elizabeth Chadwick. These books follow Eleanor of Aquitaine. She was born in France, and she ended up marrying the French king, and she made the trek to the Holy Land with the French king. But her relationship with the French king wasn't very good, and they end up getting their marriage annulled. She then marries the next king of England, Henry II, and then that whole dynasty starts. Eleanor of Aquitaine is the mother of Richard the Lionheart, and a lot of us know that story of Richard the Lionheart and his brother James. I absolutely loved this series. I loved getting to know Eleanor and her life starting from when she was born and when she was a child, and I knew that she had been the wife of King Henry II, but before reading these books, I had no idea that she was once Queen of France as well. She was one of the very first prominent women in history to show her power and her strength against men. Back in that time, that was very rare. All three of these books are very intriguing. There are wars going on, there's political intrigue, and Eleanor changes over time as well as she gets older. The writing in these books are so in-depth, and the author did a great job researching all the information about Eleanor, and it was very interesting getting to know everything about her and some of the historical accuracies of England and France during those times. Elizabeth Chadwick is one of my favorite authors. I love a lot of her newer books. Now I have Heartless by Marissa Meyer, and this is sort of a Alice in Wonderland retelling, but it is about the Queen of Hearts and her backstory and how she got to where she is now. Now, Kath just wants to be a baker. She just wants to make delicacies and have her own bakery shop. But the King of Hearts wants to marry her, and her mother thinks she's too good to be just a baker. One day when Kath is at a ball at the castle, she meets Jest. And he is a very mysterious and handsome jester at the court, and he's very intriguing to her. Because the King of Hearts wants to propose to Kath, her and Jest create a secret courtship behind the king's back because they don't want to offend him. Kath wants to be able to choose her own path, but it's so hard in this mysterious, whimsy world that she lives in. This book is so good. It's so much better than I thought it was going to be when I first went into it. All I knew of the Queen of Hearts, Kath, is that she was this awful, horrible villain. And it was so interesting to see this other side of her because she was completely different than what she is in Alice in Wonderland. This book has the wonderful, whimsical world, but it is also very heartbreaking at times. Kath and Jess' relationship in this book is definitely one of my favorite romances in the books that I have read, which is why this book is one of my top favorite books. Next I have Where the Crawdads Sing by Delia Owens. And this book follows Kaya, and Kaya was abandoned in the marsh of North Carolina when she was a young girl. So she had to learn to survive in this harsh environment all by herself. One day, a young handsome boy from town was found dead, and immediately people accused the marsh girl, Kaya. People think that this marsh girl is primitive and very unintelligent, but Kaya is the opposite of what they think. She's a very intelligent woman, and she had to learn a lot of things about the marsh to be able to survive there over the years. This book was so good. It was one of those books that I just could not put the book down. I just wanted to keep reading and reading and reading. I have not yet found a book where I felt like I could not put it down. This book is so good. I had this book for a year or so before I actually picked it up to read it. And oh my gosh, I can't believe I waited so long to pick it up and read it. My sister and I read this at the same time, and she felt the same way about it. She felt like she couldn't put the book down either. And both of us ended up talking our mom into reading it as well. This book is very interesting. You learn about the marshes of North Carolina, but it also has a mystery in it, and it keeps you guessing throughout the whole book. My next favorite book is The Nightingale by Kristen Hanna, and this book takes place during World War II in German-occupied France. And this book follows two sisters who couldn't be more different, but they fight the war in their own ways. I thought this book was very interesting. I had never read a book that was about German-occupied France. So it was very interesting to read about what happened to the people and how Germany ended up occupying the country of France. But before you get into reading this book, it's a very emotional book. There were several times throughout this book that I had to pause and take a breather because it is a very heavy book. As Kristen Hanna's books most times are, it is very emotional. It made me cry several times throughout it, but that's what made the book so good. I was so invested in the characters and what happened to them, and even some of the people that weren't main characters, I was still invested in what happened to them and their journey as well. It's a very big book, so it took me a little while to get through it with the heavy content as well, but it was well worth it. It's such a great book. I would suggest this to anybody. Just make sure when you pick up and read this, you're prepared for it to take a little bit of an emotional toll on you. So my last favorite book is actually another series, and that is The Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins. Now, most of us know what The Hunger Games is either from reading the book or from watching the movies or just by word of mouth. It's a very popular book now. I read this book in high school before the movies came out, so it's been a while since I've read it. I wanted to do a reread of it soon, but this book follows Katniss, and Katniss lives in this new world called Pan Am. And there are 12 districts in Pan Am, and each year the capital picks one boy and one girl from each district to enter the Hunger Games. And in the Hunger Games, these kids that are under 18 years old have to fight to the death, and only one can win. The Hunger Games was one of those books that you just couldn't put down. You wanted to read it in one sitting. The next two books, Catching Fire and Mockingjay, were a little bit slower because they had more of a political storyline than just this first book. The first book was more just about the Hunger Games in general, but the next two books were about the world of Pan Am as well. But the Hunger Games trilogy really makes you think about things and what it would be like if we lived in a world like that, or what would cause our world to end up being that way. My husband and I actually just rewatched the movies not long ago, and I remember watching the movies and thinking that, oh, these movies are great. But when I first watched the movies, I realized some things were different from the books compared to the movies. And as a reader, that kind of irritated me a little bit, that the movies are still great. There are definitely scenes that I kind of missed that were not in the movies, and I thought I really need to reread the Hunger Games trilogy. They're just such great books. So the next two books, I don't physically own copies of them, but they're definitely one of my top favorite books. The first one is House of Salt and Sorrows by Erin A. Craig, and this is a 12 Dancing Princesses retelling. And in this book, we follow Annalay. And Annalay's sisters keep dying by mysterious circumstances. So this is a high fantasy world, meaning it's not based in our world with magical elements. It's its own world, and it has its own rules and laws. But it's so good. It's actually considered a horror. And going into it, I didn't know that that was the case, because typically I don't read horror books, but House of Salt and Sorrows was so good. There were so many times that there were such surprising scenes in it. Even though some of the scenes were quite horrifying, that made the book so much better. In the book, Annalay tries to figure out why her sisters keep dying of this mysterious circumstance, but there's also a little bit of romance thrown in as well, with some gods and goddesses in there. It's definitely a book that I would suggest you read at least once. The last book is Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. And this is my favorite classic book. It's been a while since I've read it. I think the last time I read it was in 8th grade. I definitely need to do a reread of it, but it is so good. We follow Jane Eyre, and she goes and becomes a governess for Edward Rochester's children. Edward Rochester is very closed off and comes across kind of gruff at first, but Jane Eyre ends up warming up to him. But there's something mysterious about him, something that he is hiding. If you like classic books, this is definitely one to pick up if you haven't picked it up already. It's a little darker than some other classics that I have read, such as Pride and Prejudice, but it is a great story. It keeps you guessing as well, just kind of like House of Salt and Sorrows. Jane Eyre isn't a horror book, but it has that mystery to it as well that keeps you interested in the story. But the Jane Eyre, I felt like what most drew me into the book was the romance between Jane and Edward. Their romance and their story of how they fell in love is just so different than a lot of other romances in other books. So those are all my top current favorite books. Thank you so much for watching my video today. Make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon if you want to be notified when I post new content. I'll link all my social media accounts down below if you want to check those out and keep updated on what I am currently reading. I'll see you next time. Bye.